Hey everyone, I'm rather incoherent, and I want to talk about what makes investigators strong. There are three main things that contribute to this: their stat line, their abilities, and their card pools, and it's very hard to evaluate at a glance which one is causing a character to be strong or weak. A lot of characters are like Rex Murphy. They have an incredible stat line, an incredible ability, and the card pool is absolutely sick. Seeker cards are fantastic, and 5 Splash from Dunwich has gotten really good as more and more expansions have accrued, and the card pool has gotten bigger and bigger. I think it's hard to look at a character and immediately say, oh, they're doing badly because of their stat line, or they're doing well because of their ability, and especially, they're being carried or held down by their card pool. Those are kind of hard to do if you just look at a card and try to figure out from there. So instead, what I've done is I've built several different tier lists, and I'm going to compare them to try to figure out exactly what it is making characters strong. This is the weirdest tier list we're going to be talking about today. This is the stat line tier list. If you've seen the video, then you know how this works, but if you haven't, then let me give you a brief summary. I'm using an adjusted sum of squares. If you add everyone's stat lines together, most characters get you 12, and those characters aren't the same. They have different degrees of optimization to their stat line. And what sum of squares is going to do is it's going to square all those values before you add them together to highlight how more focused stat lines are more valuable. It's much better to have 2 4s and 2 2s than it is to have 4 3s. That said, it doesn't work perfectly because not all stats are relevant. So we're using some adjusted stats, some derived statistics that I created. One of them is the highest proactive stat you're using. Whether that's your 4 in bulk or your 4 in fist, that's the one I care about. I don't care about the one you're not using. A fighter's book is almost irrelevant, and a Kluver's fist legitimately is irrelevant. So I don't count those in my sum of squares at all. However, if I do that, and I've got 1 proactive stat and 2 defensive stats, it overrepresents the value of good defenses, so I use an average defensive value of head and foot. That does 2 things. First, it accurately emphasizes the value of proactive stats by putting it at 1-to-1 with defensive stats. And the second thing it does is it lessens the value of having a really high defensive stat that you're not able to use proactively. Now, you may notice looking at this that this does not work well with mystics. Most of them are very high on the tier list, and I'm sad to see that Jim is the only one standing out at the bottom, as always. What I've done with mystics is I've considered their highest proactive stat to be their head because that's true, but that means they rank very highly. There are a couple of characters that have big asterisks next to them when I get to them on the tier list. Rita Young is an example, where they should be ranked higher like Safina is, because with Safina, I've used her highest proactive stat as head. Or foot, either one. Because realistically, it's not her fist or her book, and to say so would be to misrepresent them. There are a couple of characters that do this that are not Safina or Mystics, and I'll cover them specifically when we get to them on the tier list. With this tier list, I've sorted it out into groups. Norm Withers at 31.25 and up is what I'm considering an optimized stat line. 29 to 25 is Tony Morgan down to this massive block of 25s, which are the good stat lines. 22.25 to 20 are the average stat lines, with Joe being the bottom and barely making the cut. And 18 to 0 are the suboptimal stat lines. Which is to say, it's the gimmick characters, Ashcan Pete, and a bunch of green characters in Lola Hayes. Let's talk about why those green characters are there. My formula sees no difference in Winifred Havelock, Skids O'Toole, and Ginny Barnes. 3 plus 3 is 6, 1 plus 5 is 6. Same character as far as the formula is concerned. And with Ginny Barnes, that's an accurate representation of her. And with Skids, it's still an accurate representation of him. But with Winifred, who's going to be relying on her foot much more, it is somewhat disingenuous. And here I have some examples of what these differences in numbers mean. An S-tier character versus an A-tier character is usually the difference in having 5 in your proactive stat and not having that. A-tier versus B-tier is much more minor, but it is a meaningful difference. It tends to be having 1 less defensive stat somewhere. And in exchange, what you're going to do is you're going to see that character waste a point into their book. This is my ability tier list, and a big asterisk, people like Calvin Wright and Diana and Lola Hayes, their abilities don't exist in vacuums. Their abilities, because they were gimmick characters, were printed with their stat lines in mind. So yes, Diana's got an insane ability, so does Calvin. But part of that ability is their stat line of having 1 in head or a 0 in everything. Lola Hayes' ability literally ruins her entire idea of being a flexible any class character, but the only reason she got 0 to 3 everything is because of her abilities limiting it. So I've taken that into consideration when I've ranked gimmick characters. And this is really just an explanation of all of that. Having all zeros is part of Calvin's ability, I rank it as such. This is my current tier list for the game. I constantly change it as I play the game, as I reevaluate things. And it's not the same as the 2-tier list for fighters and cloovers that I posted recently. About 2 months ago now, I think. I won't be covering any major changes to these characters. Aside from obviously combining the tier list into one, there have been changes throughout the tier list up and down for various different characters for various different reasons. And if you have questions, ask them in the comments, I'll be happy to answer them. But I'm not going to be covering this tier list in any great detail beyond just telling you this is the one that I'm ranking and establishing what these ranks mean. Because most of these ranks are good. When I say fine, I mean it. C-tier investigators might have no compelling reason to be picked compared to higher ranked investigators, but they keep pace with the game. They're not falling behind, they're not actually weak. They have problems, don't get me wrong, but they are not weak. They are not being crushed by the game just because you pick them. S-tier investigators are broken. They can carry their team throughout the whole campaign. A-plus investigators are still overpowered. They have easily mitigated weaknesses if they have any at all, and they excel in either their role or their team utility, but they aren't quite hard carrying their team the whole game like an S-tier character could. A investigators are very powerful. They're great, but either weaker than their A-plus competitors or just with much more pronounced weaknesses. And while B-tier investigators are strong enough to outpace the game, but have much greater weaknesses, or more niche uses, or simply aren't as strong as higher-ranked investigators. And coming back to this, I do want to point out that I'm generally quite happy with where I have people on this tier list, except for my B-tier. Almost every single person in my B-tier I feel intensely conflicted about, which is probably a good thing, but might mean that something's horribly wrong. And I want to make a quick point that not all tier lists have the same rankings. Statline is just S, A, B, C. Ability has S plus and A plus, and my tier list does not have an S plus, but it does have an A plus. For our first character with Roland, I'm going to explain how I'm doing this. We're going to be going in expansion order. I'm going to compare all three of their rankings. With a lot of characters, all three of their rankings are at basically the same place, and there's not a lot to be learned from it. But with some characters, they're going to be very different than you might expect, and that means there's something interesting to be learned. With Roland, I'm very conflicted about it. A statline ranking of B is fine. His defensive stats aren't great, but he has a 4 in his proactive stat. That's just what that means. And usually statline rankings don't hold down a character, or really elevate them that much. They tend to be largely the least important factors, what I've learned by doing this. And his ability ranking of A+ is awesome, and his card pool is arguably the best part of him, but he doesn't make it into A+ on my tier list. And the reason I feel that way is because between his 3 head and his 5 horror soak, he's very frail to horror damage, and his weakness can give him random but still unavoidable horror trauma. I think he does have the tools required to mitigate this, mostly, but he's just frail enough that I don't feel comfortable calling him overpowered. I have him right at the top of my A tier, and that's where I feel he belongs, because he really can't ever be truly safe from this weakness, even though he has really good tools to deal with it. And the reason that something like this is going to be true for Roland, but not for some other characters with bad head and bad horror soak like Tony Morgan, is because Tony Morgan's weakness isn't dealing him random, unavoidable horror trauma. That's a huge part of what makes me so worried for Roland and what's keeping him out of the A+ tiers. With Daisy Walker, she's being elevated very clearly by her card pool. Her stat line ranking of S is awesome, don't get me wrong, but her ability ranking of A is not that impressive, and the reason she's getting into A+ is because of how gross Seeker cards are. Being a Seeker with access to Purple Splash, so Promise of Power and Rapture, that sort of stuff, and Word of Protection level 2, that is just really, really good. She's clearly being elevated by her card pool. With Agnes, I have her in Statline S. You're going to see a lot of Mystics up here. Her ability only ranked at B. I don't think it's a reliable ability, but at tier list ranking, I have her in A. I think Mystics generally struggle to become overpowered. As a class, they tend to be inherently good but not broken. And a lot of that has to do with their lack of mobility and awkwardness dealing with certain quantities of clues or damage. But Agnes's card pool is very, very good because Survivor 0-2 helps out that Mystic card pool a lot. And honestly, I could see raising her even more in the future. She's very clearly elevated by her card pool. With Wendy Adams, she has a B in her stat line ranking because of this 3 in book, but if I considered her foot to be her proactive stat, which is a way to build Wendy that I think is actually the optimal way to build her, it would have been an S, and she'd be S's across the board, so I really don't think there's anything to learn from Wendy. Skids is bad. Skids is bad in every respect. He still manages to keep pace with the game, but there is no compelling reason to pick Skids at any level. His stat line ranking is a C. Having a 3 in your proactive stat, whichever one it is, sucks. His ability, you don't have the kind of money to use that. It just doesn't really work. And his tier list ranking, well, he doesn't have a good stat line, he doesn't have a good ability. And as a consequence, his tier list ranking is C. He's held down by his stat line, he isn't elevated by his ability. And even though green 0-5, blue 0-2 is a good card pool for a fighter, his stat line just doesn't work with it. If you took any of these 3 stats, took a point out and moved it to his fist, it would improve him tremendously. he'd immediately pop up to at least middle of B tier. It's really sad how bad this 3-fist is hurting him. So even though he's largely the same across the board, I'm going to make it clear that that doesn't properly cover how important this bad stat line is for him. He really is held down by his stat line, even though these ranks are the same. With Nathaniel Joe, he's got an amazing stat line, he's super well optimized, he's got an amazing ability. Why is he only an A? Well, it comes to my definitions of tiers. He's not overpowered. He excels at killing enemies, but he doesn't really do anything else. That's kind of it. And unfortunately, if all you do is kill enemies good, there are a lot of people that kill enemies good and either find clues or heal their teammates or do something else. Just killing enemies really, really good isn't enough to get out of my A tier, just at a fundamental level. He's right at the top of my A tier, but he can't climb out of it because he's too focused on something that has a limit to how important it is to be good at it. So Nathaniel Cho is really being held down by being over-specialized. Harvey Walters is amazing no matter how you look at him, nothing else to say. Jacqueline's showcasing something that Skids also showcase. Stat lines very rarely elevate a character. They're never pushing you up in the tiers. What they're usually doing is being icing on the cake as a part of the reason you fall where you are, or they're being noticed because they're holding you down. Her S in stat line, of course, she's a 5-head mystic. But she's got an A+ ability, and she falls into A+ with her mono purple card pool. Her stat line isn't fixing that. Stella Clark's an interesting one. You wouldn't expect this stat line ranking to have the asterisk next to it. But Quick Learner works so well in Stella Clark that I think it's worth pointing out that it's there. She can usually fail her first action and then take 3 more actions, 1 at this stat line, and 2 with +2 essentially to this stat line. As a fighter, that doesn't work so well. You could argue her proactive stat would be 5, but if your first 2 actions suck as a fighter, that tends to be pretty dangerous. So more accurately, I think you'd be looking at a 4 in book if you're arguing that, and you'd get a stat line somewhere in the 8s. And that's exactly what I would argue. That's how I play Stella, and I think it's the best way to play Stella. She has an ability that's easily an S+. She's basically just getting an extra action unless she did so well she couldn't possibly need it. And then on top of that, you get neither rain nor snow. Tier list ranking, easy S. Mono Red's not the best card pool, her stat line's not the best, even with Quick Learner. But her ability and her unique signature cards are so good, combined with using Quick Learner to get her proactive stats up. She's just good enough. She's very, very solid in every respect. She's the only character where I'd be genuinely surprised if you told me they didn't carry their weight. With everyone else in the game, even if you said Rex didn't carry his weight, I could imagine something happening to cause that. Some treachery card, or some series of bad results on Mythos cards that just almost kill him and force him to play differently. Stella Clark's the only character in the game where they should do 25% more work than you expect out of someone every scenario. She's just insanely reliable, and that gets her into the S tier. Winifred Havamok has a C in the stat line ranking unless you consider her 5 and her foot to be her proactive stat, and then it jumps to S. Her ability is insane. It usually draws you 2 cards a turn, sometimes more. That's absolutely wild, and there are plenty of green cards that capitalize well on this, so why is she in my B tier? I feel like I'm committing a lot of skills and I'm drawing a lot of cards when I play Winifred, and I'm doing things. She's a good character, but none of those skills were deduction. None of those skills really did that much. That's how I tend to feel when I'm playing Winifred. I'm triggering my ability all the time, I'm drawing a lot of cards, I tend to be passing any test I'm taking because I'm committing multiple skills to all of them, but at the end of the day, I'm not really getting a lot of action compression, and I have to put so many skills in my deck to make this work that I'm not really getting any broken setup assets combined together to do something really powerful with. So even though her card pool excels at committing multiple cards to the same test, it doesn't excel at actually doing a lot with it. She's still good because drawing this many cards and committing that many skills is going to make you good. It's going to carry you that far at least. Zoe Samaras has A's across the board. Great stat line, great ability, great character. It's hard to point to any specific thing about her that is more important than the rest. Rex Murphy. There's not a lot to say about Rex. His stat line is actually relatively balanced. Compared to a lot of the shit you see with Seekers, this is fine. And his ability is absolutely insane, which puts him solidly at the top of my S tier. The only reason he's not an S+ on my tier list is because there isn't an S+ to put him in. If I wanted to, I can make a Meta Knight tier and put Rex Murphy in it alone. But that seems pointless, so I didn't. I would say he's elevated by his ability, but it's not like his cards are bad at all. and his stat line is still good, very good. Most characters are not A's. I feel really bad for Jem every time I make a video where I analyze characters, because I've talked to people in the comments about it. Jem is probably actually a good character. He might deserve to get out at B, even though he's just a mystic. Because just being a mystic might be good enough. Because his stat line is an A. Like, the stat line isn't very good, but when your defensive stats are your proactive stats, that's just inherently really powerful, and the card pool of mystics is inherently very good. His ability might not be very good. His trumpet might not be very good. And as a consequence, he might not be that good. But maybe just being a mystic, and especially a mystic with 5 slash, you can do a lot with that, might just be good enough to get out of C tier. He might be getting underranked, but as far as I'm concerned, it's really just all of him. I think it's possible that someday this tier list ranking will say B and I would consider him elevated by his card pool, but right now I think it's just sort of everything's about the same. I know the stat line ranking says A because he's a mystic, but this is literally the worst that a mystic stat line can be until they print someone with a 1 in foot. A 1 in foot without a 5 in head, I mean. So honestly, I think everything with Jem is about the same. He's not elevated or held down by anything. He's just sort of there with everything. But it's possibly that just being there with a mystic card pool means he should be higher than this on the tier list, and I'm underestimating him. The stat line ranking for Ashcan Pete is the bottom. He's a C. His stat line is terrible, but that's because he has Duke to fix it. And Duke is giving him a free move every turn, usually. It's pretty sick. Unfortunately, I really don't think he's able to get into the A+ ranks, because the way his soak lines up versus autofails repeatedly means that he might not die, but Duke might if you don't get an ally out quickly. And except for your Duke action every turn, which is going to be absolutely incredible, you're left with this stat line, and trying to make it work can be a bit of a hassle. So even though his ability is incredible, he really is held down by his stat line and stuck in the A card pool. At the same time, the only reason he's workable is because of his ability, which is elevating him. I think it would be fair to say that I should have evaluated Ashcan Pete as a gimmick character with these two as being part of the same thing. And in that case, his ability would have dropped and his stat line being a C would be part of his ability and everything would be about the same. And I think that's an honest representation of Ashcan Pete. He's just kind of A's across the board once you consider him as a gimmick character, which for some reason I wasn't doing previously. Jenny Barnes is sadly one of the worst stat lines in the game. 3s across the board seems balanced and like you can do anything, and then you realize just how much work it takes to make anything happen. Thanks to Gios and the Black Fan, Jenny Barnes has very specific builds available to her that make her stat line go from trash to one of the best in the game, but that takes a lot of experience. However, the Green Man Medallion gets her there. The Green Man Medallion gets her to like 90 experience decks that are completely broken, so why is she only in C on my tier list ranking? In my tier list, I think I originally put her in A somewhere, and every time since that video that I've adjusted my tier list, I've moved her down a little bit. Every single time. And I can finally articulate why now that I have her lower in the C tier. The Green Man Medallion is going to make your first couple scenarios harder to make the rest of the game easier. But the first couple scenarios can usually be some of the hardest scenarios in a campaign, and if you're able to beat those while the Green Man Medallion is holding you down, then you probably could have beaten the entire campaign with any other character. I'm not pretending that Jenny is not going to steamroll the second half of any campaign. She looks like an S tier character in the second half of my Carcosa run. But getting through those first 2 scenarios with the Green Man Medallion is such a problem that I can't actually put her higher on the ranking than C. Also, the Green Man Medallion is anathema to fun, so that's a thing. But that's not relevant to a power rankings. The big thing for me is that if you're able to get to the point where Green Man Medallion is breaking the game in your favor, you had to do so many things that were so hard to get there that another character could have done the same thing that Jenny's doing. There's almost no campaign with a power curve where it makes sense to use Green Man Medallion. So ultimately, I think that she's just a C, kind of across the board, and that I was being too kind to her when I judged the Green Man Medallion. I think this should have been a C. That said, the reason that she would still be a C is because of this stat line. If she had a 4 in either productive stat, whether that meant she became a fighter or a clover, I don't care which, her tier list ranking would go up a lot. Having the Green Man Medallion would be much more tolerable if you didn't have to go through so much work to do something in the game. Mark Harrigan's an S. In every regard. His stat line is ridiculous. Why do we have 13 points instead of a 1 in book? I don't know. Couldn't tell you. His ability? It's insane. Draw cards all the time, pass any tests you want to. His tier list ranking, very near the top. He's just very, very good. There's nothing bad about Mark. He's one of the best characters in the game. I can't point to a reason why, because it's everything. Minty Fan's got a good stat line, and her ability isn't very good, but her signature is insane. And I think tier list wise, that puts her near the top of A because of her very powerful Seeker card pool, especially with early power coming from the Survivor cards before she largely upgrades out of them. There's a couple of cutesy things she can do with scavenging shenanigans, but honestly, just compared to the normal broken Seeker stuff, it's not that much better in my opinion. I think a big reason that Minty Fan ranks high in A is because of the card pool that gets her there. I don't think that her ability would be nearly so good if she were a different class that would struggle to find Analytical Mind, but a Seeker can just bulldoze their deck and find Analytical Mind very quickly. Or they can do something like No Stone 5 or Mr. Rook to find it with a little bit more finesse than that. There's plenty of ways for Seekers to get to Analytical Mind quickly though, which is very important. And then she's doing very strong things with the Seeker card pool on top of that. I think the best part of Min is her card pool and that she's very clearly being elevated by that. Moving on to Akachi, her stat line is one of the best in the game. I mean that. She is right at the top. 5 head, 3 foot is as good as a stat line gets because these two in the middle don't exist for Akachi. Her stat line is insanely well optimized. And in fact, this is also really good. 3 Fist means she's a great user of the Cyclopean Hammer. It's about as good as a stat line can get. Her ability is good. There's not a lot to say about her ability, it's just very good. It adds a charge to every asset you play, which means that you're going to come into play with 25% more uses on your fight assets and 33% more uses on your clue finding assets, and that's really, really good. And she's a character I have near the top of B tier. One of many characters I feel conflicted about. I'm like, man, maybe I should move her up to A tier. And when you look at this, you can see why I'm feeling conflicted about it. When I try to tell you why Akachi's not in my A tier, I can't articulate why. She just doesn't feel like she should be, and I think I'm wrong. And while this is the first time I've mentioned this on this video, I've had this PowerPoint for about 2 weeks now. I've been thinking about it. There are characters where I looked at it and it's like, stat line A, ability A, tier list B, and I was like, oh, am I wrong? And then I moved them up because I realized by looking at this stuff that I was wrong. But with Akachi, even though I have this niggling doubt that I'm wrong, I feel like she should be higher on the tier list, somewhere towards the bottom of A at least. I can't tell you why, but I don't feel like she is. It makes me really want to play Akachi to see why I'm so conflicted about her. In my notes, I've written that she's held down by her card pool, and her card pool is basically mono purple. Like, honestly, the difference in her card pool and Jacqueline's, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I can't tell you what Akachi is getting that I care about. I don't know. And that's real bad, because I know that I spent at least 20 minutes of my life looking at all the cards available to Akachi and being disappointed. I don't remember any of them. I think she gets Hallowed Mirror and Occult Lexicon, though, which are good cards, I will admit that. Honestly, if that's right, if she gets Hallowed Mirror and Occult Lexicon, that might deserve to move her up to A tier. Those are very good cards. Anyway, I'm done wondering why Akachi's here. I do dislike her card pool, and I dislike being a basically mono-purple mystic. But I think that's personal bias, and she probably should be higher on the tier list, and will eventually move up once I play her. William Yorick is a stat line A, it's just a good stat line for proactively 6 total defenses. Ability A+, recurring things from your graveyard is very good. It's just an inherently super powerful effect, his star is great, his signature ability gives you bonus experience over the course of a campaign, which as I've talked about in other videos, the game is not balanced or delved too deep. William Yorick's ability is literally something the game isn't balanced around and is going to make the end of the campaign disproportionately easier than it should have been. And tier list A+. This is all basically the same. I'd argue the most important part of this is his card pool. It's things like Hallowed Mirror and Soothing Melody that allow him to function as a healer for his team, or things like Short Supply synergizing with his ability that really elevate him to an A+ character. But it's sort of all of it. It's his stat line working, it's his ability allowing it, it's his card pool. It's sort of all of it coming together perfectly to put Will Yorick exactly where he is on the tier list. Even though the card pool feels a little bit more important, I would say it's all more or less the same. For Safina, she's got a stat line ranking of an S because she's got 4 in all the stats that are being counted. I gave her an ability ranking of A, but honestly, I think it should have been a B. I think I was too kind to her. I think the idea of duplicating events is really cool, but a lot of the most important events in the game don't really need to be duplicated, and it's going to vary a lot from scenario to scenario exactly what ends up under you and how many times you get to duplicate it. It's very high variance. Of course, she does to some degree mitigate that variance with her opening 13 card hand, but it's still high variance, even though she's drawing more cards than anyone else. The impact those cards have, because they're going under you and potentially being duplicated, is disproportionately high. And again, I might say this with every B tier character, I feel conflicted about where I've placed her. I feel like she's obviously good, but I don't feel like she's particularly doing anything that I care about. I don't feel like she's doing anything super powerful. I think it's hilarious that she can essentially run 9 copies of Warded Protection because 3 Painted Worlds, 2 Warded Protections, 2 Counter Espionages, and 2 Money Talks. You can just have, like, the highest number of cancel events possible make Diana blush. And that's really cool, but why? What's the point? Something about the way that she plays to me doesn't work. I think a big part of why I don't like her so much is that she really doesn't have much of an ability. She gets a slightly bigger opening hand and a slightly better mulligan phase, but her ability does nothing beyond that. And that's just a little bit less good than you would expect out of a character's ability. The Painted World is sick, but her ability is very lackluster. Lola Hayes is also very lackluster in every regard. Her stat line is bad. She copied Jenny's stat line and she should have copied her homework from someone else. Her ability is only not in the F tier because I consider it a part of her deck building rules that she would never be allowed to play cards from any class unless she had this ability to limit it. But if I were to pretend that they weren't linked, her ability would be F tier. It's the reason her gimmick doesn't work. It's because you're required to do this roll nonsense. And on the tier list, she's not right at the bottom. I still think she's probably better than Skids, but she's very close to the bottom. And it's everything. It's her bad stat line. It's her ability that literally does nothing. And it's her card pool that is a lot less good than it should be because you have to build your deck around this ability that's eventually going to, or not this ability, but this weakness that's eventually going to ruin you. Everything in Lola feels bad. And it's weird to me because I feel so negatively about the characters I have at the bottom of C tier, but I genuinely don't feel they deserve to be in a D tier. I think they keep pace with the game. I've got Skids at the bottom of my C tier, and I successfully performed my job as the primary fighter through the entirety of the Circle Undone, which is, in no one's opinion, an easy campaign. The return to Circle Undone. I don't know if that makes it easier or harder. I honestly couldn't tell you what the differences were off the top of my head. But the fact that what I view as the worst character in the game can do a primary role job throughout an entire campaign and never really fail to do it tells you a lot about how I view the characters in this game. I don't think Lola's good at all. And everything I'm going to say about her is going to be negative, but I still think she keeps pace with the game. I still think that she's quote-unquote fine. But a lot of characters lower in my C tier I would never recommend to a new player. And I think that's the truest with Lola. With Skids, you're tricking them and teaching them a lesson about high proactive stats. With Lola, you're just ruining the game for them. Leo Anderson's got a good enough stat line. He's got 5 total defenses, but they're well split at 4 and 1. That means you have one stat that you know you're screwed on, you need to plan around with other means, and then one stat that's actually pretty good. That's probably how you would want a B tier stat line to be distributed. And then the 4 in Fist is, good enough. You're a Guardian, that's what you expect. The 3 in Book will find some limited use, but usually won't matter much. His ability is very good. It's essentially gain 1 action, gain 1 resource for the first couple turns of a scenario. And that's when these additional actions and resources will be the most helpful, is during the setup phase. It's just a really, really good ability. The main reason it can't be higher is because you only get to use it at most 5 times a scenario normally. It's still very, very good. And the fact that it's getting focused towards the front part of the campaign when you need to come online and start doing your job is really, really nice. His tier list ranking of A+ is because of his card pool. I made a video about Healer Leo. The fact that he's able to use an 8-base Cyclopean Hammer with Leo Anderson and Haste makes him a fucking monster in the late game. And he's able to take that same 5-action turn when there are no enemies and spam out Soothing Melodies with a Howled Mirror. And that just makes him so strong, both offensively and in terms of team utility, that he easily gets to be near the bottom of my A+ tier. It takes experience to get him there, but it's not like he starts off bad. He's got a very good defensive stat. He's a Guardian with good splash colors and 4 Fist. He is, by the skin of his teeth, an A+ character, and it's definitely because of his card pool. Ursula's an A+ all around. There are no A+ on the stat line. You're either an A or an S, and so she's right at the top of the A's. She's got very good defensive stats, a 4 and a proactive stat. She's got a fantastic ability. It's not quite as good as Rex's, but it's pretty close to Rex's ability. And a tier list ranking of A+ because her card pool is kind of bad. it basically is just you get Karen's Opal and nothing else, which is a kind of shitty place to be. Karen's Opal is sick, though, and you can take it within the thick of it for 17 more experience over the course of a campaign, which is a lot. I think the big reason that Ursula makes it into A+ is this ability. Her card pool is just Mono Seeker with Karen's Opal, as far as I'm concerned, which is still a good card pool, to be honest, but not the best. It's her ability that keeps Ursula where she is on the tier list, because it legitimately is just like 2/3 of a Rex or something like that. Father Mateo is a Mystic, therefore his stat line can't be lower than an A. His abilities, it does something positive for you. It's not literally a blank like some people are, but it's not doing a lot. It's the very bottom of my B tier, I believe. And his tier list ranking is right near the top of my C tier, right next to Jim and Calvin. Like Jim, I'm afraid that Father Mateo might get moved up to my B tier just on the back of being a Mystic, which is just upsetting to me. I don't want that to be true, but I think it might be. But honestly, this doesn't look like everything's the same. It looks like it's progressively getting worse, but this is about the worst stat line a Mystic can have. And his ability is as bad as a B tier ability really could be, and he's as good as a C tier investigator really can be. I actually think Mateo is kind of the same across the board, even though these numbers, or these rankings rather, are not the same. The stat line ranking for Calvin is a C. He's right at the bottom of that tier list. His ability ranking is an A, but honestly, I just moved it from top of B to bottom of A right at the end of the video as a joke to see if my friend Andrew, who loves Calvin, would even notice, and he didn't. I'm very sad about it. He's really a B tier ability, and it's because of the setup time that his stat line incurs. And tier list, I got him right at the bottom of C. I want him to be higher. I want him to be, legitimately good, but his setup time just absolutely sucks. Don't get me wrong, if you're going to put some random cards in a mono-red Investigator, Stand Together level 3 and Ward of Protection level 2 are some of the best in the game. But his card pool doesn't quite get him out of the B tier, or into the B tier, rather. I like Calvin a lot, but the setup time is just brutal, and I don't think his card pool gets him to do anything that's worth the setup time afterwards. And I think it is sort of all the same, just like Father Mateo, because sure, C, B, and C, that looks different. It looks like his ability is substantially better than the rest of them. But the reason he's falling into C is because he's forced to build this high soak deck. And the deck building constraints that are getting placed on him by this ability are the real reason that he's being stuck in C. There's not room in his deck for any of the really cool things that might get him out of there. You can look at him like, oh, Scavenging with a Meat Cleaver and an Ice Pick, and then you can swing it for 3 or Investigate and get it back. That seems really good, but then you try to fit it into a deck and it just never works. You're always cutting something you really don't want to cut in Calvin. So I think it's everything, and it's because of his ability. Which, makes sense. He's the most gimmicky gimmick character. It all ties together in a sort of unavoidable way. With him at Edwards, he has to be in a stat line. The 1 in the head is not doing him any favors. Like many rogues, he decided that he would just take a 3 in a stat he wasn't going to be using very much. You look at his ability ranking, it's a good ability. 3 actions are absolutely incredible, but he's only getting to evade with his. He does have base 4 foot, though, and it's as a free action, so evading gets a lot more appealing. But it's still not the most insane thing in the world. It's just good. Very good, but not amazing. And tier list ranking, I've got him in a B right now. Every time we talk about a B tier investigator, I'm going to say the same thing. I'm really conflicted about that. I want him to be higher. And then I look at the characters of my A tier, and I'm like, ah, shit. Before I recorded this video, I did a quick test, and I moved everyone where my gut should say they were from B tier. There were 3 characters left in B tier. Everyone went up to A tier or down to C tier. And then I looked at A tier and C tier, and I was like, wow, there's a really wide range of power here. It's like I should move some of them down from A tier to the B tier, and some of them up from C tier to the B tier to more accurately represent it. I moved them all back, and then we had the tier list I currently have, where I'm super conflicted about my B tier. I think Finn's a good character. I think Finn's a very good character. But in Arkham Horror, there's a lot of characters that are better than very good. I think it's mostly his card pool. He has Rogue 0-3, Illicit 0-5, which is like Rogue 0-3 plus some random ones from 4-5, including all the weapons. Finn's splash cards are very good. The Survivor and Seeker cards that he gets up to 5 of, those are great. But missing out on some of the bigger rogue cards isn't doing him any favors. Especially cards like Double Double or Black Fan, things that would really allow him to do some of the more broken combo stuff that rogues have available. Coming over to Carolyn, her stat line's a B. She doesn't have a great stat. She's missing one, but to be fair, she's still better than some of the characters on the tier list. And her ability is also a B for me. To be honest, it's a low B for me. I don't really care about the idea that you can give somebody a resource when you heal them. That's not enough to make me want to heal more than I normally would have. And frankly, the fact that she's in B tier is because of her incredibly good deck building. She gets so much versatility in what cards she's allowed to buy. So even though this all looks the same, I think the reason she's making it a B tier is actually her card pool. If she were just mono Guardian with cards that could heal horror, I don't think she'd make it to my B tier. It's that big pile of Seeker and Survivor cards she gets to throw in for no reason that really gets her into my B tier. And it gets her high into my B tier. Or high in my heart. I don't actually know where she's placed right now because they've been moving around so much in the B tier. But I am conflicted about her, like everyone else in that tier. I feel like she could move up to A. I feel like she's very strong, but then I look at the people on A tier, I'm like, oh shit, how do I move her up higher than this? With Joe Diamond, he's actually the lowest ranking B stat line there is. He's got 2 and 2 in his defensive stats. At one point in time, I had him as my top of C tier, but I decided that having 4 in a proactive stat made him more similar to the Bs than the Cs. His ability ranking's an X. It's absolutely crazy. The Hunch deck is essentially draw 1 extra card at up to -2 cost every turn of the game. It's really good. The Hunch deck is fantastic. But in terms of my tier list ranking, he's being held down by the stat line. Fixing that 2-2 is necessary. If you don't fix the 2-2, you're going to get bit by every Mythos card you ever draw. It's going to be a brutal time. You have to do something to fix it. And that means you're going to be spending card slots and resources and actions, and worst of all, experience fixing this problem. And that really holds him down. I think what he's doing is frequently insane, but to do it safely just holds him back so much from where he could have been. And he, like Roland, is held down by his frailty. Diana Stanley's stat line and ability are really part of a package deal. You get the D tier stat line for the A tier ability, and that sort of means you just don't even look at the stat line anymore. It's just the A tier overall for having this stat line with this ability. In my tier list, I've got her in B. What she's doing is super strong, but frequently recurring your cards that you canceled with is recurring stuff you got low value on because you just threw it away to get them under you in the first place. And unfortunately, being a 6-head Mystic isn't even that impressive. There are a lot of 5-head Mystics that don't start off with 1 head. Agnes has 5-head, and she can run Pete Sylvester to have infinite horror soak, so she doesn't even need to cancel the cards, and then she's a 6-head Mystic, just like Diana. Just like what Diana does seems so good, and then I compare it to every other Mystic, I'm like, oh man, I wish you did a lot more than this. I like Diana, she's very, very good. She is a great poster child for me feeling conflicted about my B tier. But at the end of the day, just like Kelvin, she's getting a big ball of stats in exchange for setup time, and the big ball of stats isn't really doing that much for her. Marie Lambeau's got a good stat line because she's a Mystic, she's got a good ability. So if she's got a good stat line and a good ability, why is she only in C tier? Well, like all the Mystics I have in C tier, it's possible she should be in B tier because she is a Mystic with 4 head. That is true. And it's also possible that she has some builds I haven't cracked yet that people have talked to me about in the comments, where she actually gets like legitimately quite high in B tier and maybe even breaks out of it. I don't know. But for me, I feel like her 4-in book doesn't really do a lot of work, unfortunately. She really is just a 4-head Mystic. Her splash cards don't really do as much work as I want them to, and her ability is sketchy to capitalize on. If it triggered more, if it felt like I had more control over it, I would like it a lot more. But I feel like most of the Doom cards aren't good cards, and the ones that are good cards aren't giving you enough Doom to use her ability as often as I would like to. Again, I feel conflicted about Marie, but I feel like really the thing holding Marie down is everything. If she's in B tier, it's probably just because she's a Mystic, not because of anything unique to her. And I feel like her ability is actually a little bit sketchy, like I overranked it at A. Honestly, I feel like with Marie, her ability in a vacuum is much better than it is in actual gameplay. In actual gameplay, it's really just Arcane Initiate and David Renfield that I even won't put in my deck. The rest of the Doom cards don't feel good to me. I don't want to run them, even in Marie. And that's a good example of why I feel that she's so janky to build and to play and doesn't quite line up and ever do what I want Marie to do. And why she's at the top of my C tier instead of making it higher into B. Rita is the reason that I changed my formula. Originally, it told me, I wasn't counting Mystics at all at this point in time, but when I first did my table, it said Rita is as good as Mark, one of the best stat lines in the game. And I said, no, that's wrong. Let me figure out what my formula is doing incorrectly. However, if you evaluate Rita as having 5 foot be her main proactive stat that she uses, which is, to me, a little bit disingenuous, but still true enough that it's worth mentioning, she'd have an S in stat line, one of the best optimized stat lines in the game, even. I think it is definitely worth noting that she really does have to use her other stats a decent amount. It's not just foot checks all the time with her like some characters. And in fact, most of these characters with the asterisk on their stat line when they're using their foot are not using their foot all the time, and it's probably some combination of the ranking I gave them and the ranking they would have as a foot character. But her ability is just not very good. No matter where I'm ranking her stat line, her ability kinda sucks. It lets you kill acolytes by evading them. That's its main appeal. Like, I want her ability to be sick. I'm eventually going to play her and be surprised at how much it's doing, but it's still not going to be doing that much because the bar for my expectations is so low. Also, I don't know why her weakness is so mean or her signature is so niche in use. And at the end of the day, you have this character with this really difficult to use stat line. Like, sure, she has 8 defensive stats, which is crazy. So she's got a good stat line. But it's a very hard to use stat line, and her ability isn't really helping her do much of anything. And then you look at her card pool, and it's letting you capitalize on your foot a little bit, but that's really just required for the character to be functional. It's not getting her into B tier, it's keeping her in the C tier. Without her card pool, she'd be a D tier character. She'd be the only D tier character, if the card pool that keeps her in C at all. So this is going to be a weird one. This is going to be a really weird one. Her stat line ranking is the best part of her, right? I almost feel like her stat line's the reason she's being held down. That she's being forced to play this janky game where she's trying to use green cards as a red character with limited access to them. You could argue she's held down by anything. You could say it's her stat line forcing her into this weird playstyle, and if she had a different stat line with a 4 in one of these stats, she'd be much more playable. You could say it's her ability not doing enough. You could say it's her card pool not giving her enough ability to capitalize on her stat line. I honestly think it's kind of everything, that nothing about Rita quite fits together into a powerful character for me, and she's just kind of the same across the board, and her stat line is sort of misrepresenting that. She's a good example of how I feel that stat lines really don't affect the final ranking of characters very often, unless they're holding them down. Her stat line's the best part of her, but it doesn't really affect how I feel about her. Next, we have Preston Fairmont, obviously one of the worst stat lines in the game, and obviously one of the best abilities. But even when you consider that it comes with his stat line as a cost, it's still a very good ability. And honestly, the stat line and the ability ranking sort of go hand in hand. So the fact that he ends up with this tier list ranking of an A is just in line with what I would hope he is doing. For a long time, I felt that the card pool wasn't at a point where Preston Fairmont got to live an A. I felt like he was a B or even C tier character that was just really effectively abusing a couple of small cards. But I think with Edge of the Earth, he finally has enough tricks up his sleeve that he can get into the A tier. It's still an awkward journey where you're transitioning like from Dark Horse to big money at some point. He's very unique in how he upgrades, and I really like that about him. But at the end of the day, I don't think he gets past A tier, and I think that's where he should live. I think if he ever gets out of the A tier, it's probably an alarming statement about how good Big Money Green is. Next up, we have Tommy Muldoon. B stat line, B ability, and tier list of C. I don't like Tommy. And I'm going to take a minute to try to articulate why I don't like Tommy. Well, a couple minutes have passed, and I still can't quite articulate concisely what it is about Tommy that I dislike, but I genuinely don't feel his card pool does a lot. The red card pool 0-2 is really, really good, but at the same time, I look at a Tommy level 0 deck, and I'm just not impressed by what the red cards are adding to it, unfortunately. I look at something like Blessed Tommy or a generic Guardian Tommy, and I don't see a reason to pick it over literally any other Guardian. His stat line's just fine. His ability often translates to gain resources later, but you need resources the most at the start. And his card pool just doesn't really give me any big way to capitalize on resources later. I don't really think any card pool does. Resources later is just sort of not a super powerful thing to have. And Blessed Tommy is certainly the best thing to capitalize on his card pool, but I just don't find myself impressed by it at all. So he ends up fairly low on my tier list as a consequence. Everything feels about the same, but I think I might argue that what holds him down the most, God, it's everything. He's got like the worst acceptable stat line possible. He's got an ability that's doing something, but not a lot, let's be honest. And he has a deck and card pool that really isn't elevating him at all. Everything about him is just acceptable to me. Nothing about him feels good. Come over to Mandy. Everything about her feels incredible to me, because it all is. This stat line is an abomination. I don't know how they looked at Rex and said, yeah, we should have done better than that. But they did. They just took the 2 fists and turned it into 5 book. Her ability is insane. Just roll an extra card every time you scry, and there are cards like Mr. Rook that basically let you scry every turn for the entire game. Her weakness is brutal. Her weakness is a lot to make her weaker. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't, but it's nowhere near enough to counteract it. And in the tier list ranking, of course, she ended up in S tier. She's got a Seeker card pool, and then she's able to pick from other classes at her choice for who's going to be her secondary 0-1 card pool. But let's be real, Promise of Power is pretty sick. You might want to pick purple. They've also got Enraptured. They've got plenty of things worth picking them for. Luke's got a good stat line. He's a mystic, so of course he does, but legitimately he does have a good stat line. His ability is insane. He has the best mobility in the game as a mystic, which is usually a class that struggles for mobility. And in terms of tier list rankings, Seeker 0-2 is a really good card pool to add to any color, mystics included. So does he get into my S tier? No, S tier is super competitive, but he's still very high in the A+ tier. It's because of its ability, it's because of his card pool. It's probably more his ability than his card pool, let's be honest. So I would say that Luke is very clearly elevated by his card pool, but everything about Luke is good. Coming over to Patrice Hathaway, I ranked her like Zafina as a mystic with her 4 head as her proactive stat. She uses her book a decent amount because her gimmick allows her to, but I don't think it's entirely dishonest to say she has an A tier stat line instead of a C tier stat line. What's crazy, though, is that she still does have 10 points in her stat line, despite having arguably the best gimmick ability in the game. It's nonsense. It is absolutely busted how strong draw 5 cards a turn can be. Unfortunately for her, the reality is that the cards available to her, despite making her very reliable and getting a lot done, are not going to be snapping the game in half in any respect. She's definitely very, very strong, but until I play her and see clear evidence to the contrary, I don't think she's overpowered, and I certainly don't think she's S tier. But I do think she deserves to be at least middling in the A tier. She's definitely great. I don't think she's going to be much better than this. I don't think she lives up to what her ability is promising. I really hope I'm wrong, though. If any character in my tier list moves up, I'd be the happiest to see Patrice move up. And in terms of why she's ranked where she is, it's everything. It's her ability, it's her card pool working with her ability, it's her stat line working with her card pool, it's everything working perfectly together. Patrice is sort of just like a well-oiled machine in terms of how all the parts fit together. It's not any one thing that makes her strong. Next, we've got Tony. Tony is the highest A-rate character there is. He's the only A-rate character with a 5 in their proactive stat, and it's because he's got Joe Diamond defensive stats. They're not pretty. That said, his ability is insane. A 5 in your proactive stats, very good, much better than anyone else in the A stat line, even though he does have these frailty defenses, and his green card pool gives him a lot of ways to deal with this. Whether it's Lonnie Ritter for Infinite Soak, or big money plans to just not even fail the test to begin with. His card pool is very, very strong. There are several different ways you can build him, ranging from power spiking early with blue cards, to having better draw and consistency late with yellow cards. I'm sure there's some merit to Survivor, but I haven't really thought about it very much, to be honest. Just all of Tony is very good. There's no part of him that is, like, specifically bad. If anything's trying to hold him down, it's his stat line. This card pool counteracts it well enough, as long as you're willing to go big money, that I don't really care about these at all. Sister Mary is a character that apparently I'm going to be playing very soon on the channel. Her stat line's a B. It's just not a good stat line. She has a 3 in a proactive stat, but 7 combined defenses. She's able to find some ways to use that head proactively, but as a mystic who's only 0-2, you don't have that many ways of using this forehead, unfortunately. With someone like Patrice, you have the ability to pump all the skills in the world into every check, but unfortunately for Sister Mary, she won't have anywhere near that consistency. Her ability is very good. It's basically single-handedly enabling any bless build you want, but that is all it's doing. Let's not pretend it's more than that. And her signature is, again, let's not pretend it's more than this. It's just True Grit with minor bless synergy. And unfortunately, that puts her solidly on the bottom part of my C tier. When you look at her card pool and how it interacts with their stat line, it's just not pretty. Whether that means you're making a 6 Sense Clover, who's really just investigating with 6 Sense, or a fighter who's got base 3 Fist using a Holy Spear, no matter what you do with Sister Mary, this stat line doesn't jive with this card pool. And enabling Bless is cool and all, but it doesn't fix the problem I'm talking about here. I'd say she's definitely held down by her stat line. Even though it's evaluated to a B, it doesn't work with this card pool. Amanda Sharp's a gimmick character. Her stat line of C was taken into account as part of her ability ranking of A+. In spite of the stat line being a requirement to get this ability, I still think it's an A+ level ability. I think that as a character, she barely managed to get into the A+ tier though. the amount of experience that Amanda Sharp wants to really capitalize meaningfully on this ability is a bit higher than I would want. And more than any other Seeker, she has a plan. He's going to draw cards and then duplicate deductions, and then draw cards and then duplicate deductions. And when things get in the way of that plan, it tremendously inhibits her clue finding power. If you take like a Harvey and spend a turn blood writing, it's fine. You're going to do the same thing next turn that you were planning on doing. But with Amanda, I frequently found that hemorrhaging that sort of money and changing my hand that much very frequently meant that I was back to the draw card step instead of getting to do the deduction step that I wanted to. I think Amanda's ability is very good, and it's simultaneously the reason she's as high as she is and the reason she's not higher than she is. Dexter Drake is one of many characters where I'm like, man, I wish I could put this character in S tier on my actual tier list. His stat line is incredible. He's a 5-head mystic. What do I need to say? His ability? Okay, his ability isn't incredible. It's a slightly worse version of Leo's ability in that you have to discard an asset to use it, but a slightly better one in that you're allowed to use it not only as not your first action, but throughout the whole game to constantly progress with any asset as opposed to just ally assets. It's not an S tier ability, though. The S tier thing about Dexter Drake is Molly Maxwell. She's absolutely insane. In terms of the tier list ranking, I think because of his ability to get extra actions from his green card pool and then capitalize with his total of 8 for his Cyclopean Hammer, makes him a very, very good fighter and makes him able to use some of the weaker healing events, or healing assets rather, available to Mystics in a very powerful way with his ability. It's sort of the whole thing. It all plays together very, very well. I think his card pool is actually the strongest part of him, despite the tier list ranking, the one that involves his card pool being his lowest ranking. And that's just because I have my S tiers so competitive. Getting into these higher tiers in the tier list is really difficult, and this is really all the same stuff. Dexter Drake's incredible. He's going to be great beginning to end, but I don't think he hard carries his team the way an S tier character might. Silas has a good stat line, but a much better ability. And while his card pool isn't insane, it's pretty damn good. So I don't think it's a surprise to see that he made it to A+. He's got a good enough stat line, a very good ability, and honestly a very good card pool. Not as good as his ability, but enough to work with it very well and get him into the A+ tiers. With Trish, her stat line is an A. It's good. It's a 4 proactively, total of 6 offensively. It's what we're expecting to see out of that ranking. Her ability is an A+. It's very, very good. It's Rex's ability with a hoop to jump through, or if you use it to evade an enemy, then since you chose to do that rather than getting a clue, it's presumably better than Rex's ability. Otherwise, you'd have gotten the clue, right? But that hoop to jump through is a lot of effort that won't be reliably triggering, and that really does hurt her ability ranking a lot compared to the people who actually made it to S or even S+. Our tier list ranking, well, Seeker 02 is a great splash color. That's what you want to see. He's got a good stat line. Rogues have plenty of ways to cover a 2-head weakness. The best one, obviously, is Big Money, but they have other options as well if you're opposed to that. Trish just checks out. Everything about Trish is very good. It's no individual thing, it's all of it at roughly the same power level by coincidence, which is a common story with these characters. Daniela Reyes has an insane stat line. Holy shit. This is just about as good a stat line as a character is allowed to have. This is Harvey's stat line. You just switched his book and his fist. It's absolutely insanely good. Her ability is testless damage as a fighter. Technically, there is a hoop to jump through. That hoop is just the enemy existed and wasn't dead. That's not really a hoop. That's a requirement to use this ability no matter what. If there's not a living enemy, you're not dealing testless damage. The only requirement for this to trigger is for you to have engaged the enemy. It's a little bit more complicated than that in play, but it's so easy to make use of this. And her tier list ranking is very high in A+. She's got an incredible stat line, a very good ability. Her deck building's a little bit janky. She's not being built the way I would like to build her. I look at this blue character and I look at the weapons I have to choose from and I get real sad. I think that's an impression that a lot of people have. They look at Daniela and they just feel really bad about her deck building. And I have that feeling too, but I think when I push past it and I actually try to build decks with her, they look really, really powerful and really compelling. I have a hard time imagining that she's not an A+ character. I can't point to anything about her and say it's bad. I can just be like, but blue character, no flamethrower. And then try to move her down, and I really can't justify it on that reasoning. And it's everything. It's her incredible stat line, her incredible ability, and her card pool that works very well. It provides a lot of utility. It does a lot of the things that Will Yorick's card pool does, and Will Yorick's card pool is absolutely sick. It's a little bit worse. Oh, a lot worse. This is legitimately just a worse version of Will Yorick's card pool, now that I say that. It doesn't have blue 1 and 2. It doesn't have infinite red 0. Those are clear downgrades. And that does feel pretty bad, but it's still a quite good card pool that works well enough with her ability. Norman Withers has an insane stat line. Once again, we're looking at a 4 and a 5 in your defensive stats. He's not perfectly optimized the way a couple of characters are, but he's pretty damn well optimized. His ability is crazy. His unique asset makes his ability even crazier. And in a real game, when you combo that with Astronomical Atlas, it gets ridiculous. Unfortunately, in a real game, he doesn't make it to my S ranks, and unlike a lot of the characters where I've said, this stuff's crazy, but S rank super competitive, I don't think Norman was ousted from S ranks for that reason. I think Norman was never a consideration for it, and a huge part of it is that at Seeker 0 and nothing else, you don't have the same movement tech as a Seeker would. You don't get access to deductions level 2, so sure, you're duplicating your deduction level 0 forever, but every Seeker with an upgraded deduction started off a little bit ahead of you. They've got better draw than you, they're duplicating it by just cycling their deck. Norman's very good, and he's very good on very little experience, which is a huge upside, but his lack of mobility and his 1 input, and the fact that his Mystic card pool is kind of really janky in terms of how it plays with the rest of his card pool, all hold him down a lot. I do think Norman's very good, easily A+, but I don't think he's ever considered for S tier. And I think if I had to put a reason to why Norman falls where he is, it's not all the same. His stat line's one of the best, his ability's one of the best. It's that his card pool has, like, literally no movement other than shortcut 0. The lack of movement abilities for Norman Withers really hurts him, in my opinion. And I think he might be the only Seeker where I'm going to say that his card pool is holding him down. If he had better movement options, he might make it into the S tier, but because he doesn't, he's sort of trapped in the A+ tier, especially with this 1 input as a glaring weakness that he has. Coming over to Lily Chen, I've got an asterisk in her stat line ranking. That's because she has an S if you go up to 5 fist with her starting discipline, and only an A if you go up to 4 head instead. How well optimized her stat line is depends on which way you're trying to capitalize on her card pool. And I'm actually of the opinion that maybe you want to go for the head route, that you just don't have enough weapons if you're going for fist for it to work well. With her ability, it's very, very good. You get a bunch of permanent stat boosts, and those stat boosts are going to give you a bunch of small but meaningful abilities that really do help you over the course of a scenario or a campaign. In my tier list, I've got her in relatively low A. Now, this is the reason I think it might be better to go for the head boost early. I have her in low A, specifically because if you don't hit Dragon Pole on the 5-fist build, your character is really struggling. If you don't hit exactly that weapon, you're really struggling to find a reliable way to do your job. However, if you do find that weapon, you are literally the best Scenario 1 fighter in the game, and I mean that. I think because you're so good with Dragon Pole that you don't even need the extra fist for it, you can afford to use it to get more head and better use the traditional Mystic assets to fight with. The reason she's an A is because of that Scenario 1 variant, Scenario 2 and 3 even. And if you mitigate that variance so that you're not just like best fighter or terrible fighter and you're just always at least good, then I think she can move up the tier list even from where I have her currently. Maybe not to A+, but definitely the higher in A that I currently have her. But I think she's very, very good. When I played Lily Chen, I never had that bad variance. I initially almost put her in my S tier. When things are going according to plan for Lily, she's like as good of a fighter or better even than Mark Harrigan. It's absolutely wild. And I can imagine Lily moving up the tier list a lot if we get access to more good weapons for her at Scenario 0, or Scenario 1 rather, or Level 0, whichever you want to call it. Come over to Bob Jenkins, his stat line's a B. Like many rogues, he just put a lot of points into a secondary proactive stat he was never going to use, which is always to their detriment. His ability ranking is an A, though. He gets a lot of free actions that can actually translate into free actions for your teammates instead of you, which is very helpful. And in my tier list, I have him very near the top of B tier. I think maybe I should be moving him up. He's definitely elevated by his ability. That's the strongest part of him. It's the thing that makes his card pool so relevant. I think he definitely has the right card pool for his ability. And I've heard from a lot of people that once you see him in action, he's a lot more impressive than he feels in theory. I'm hoping that's the case. But right now, I really just can't justify moving him up to A tier when even the people at the bottom of A tier are just so incredibly strong. And it's all about the same for me. There's nothing about him that stands out as the reason he's not making it to A tier. His ability is very good, but a lot of people in A tier have very good abilities, probably all of them. I think Bob is carried by his ability. It's the best part about him, but his card pool is so directly tied to that ability that I don't think it's any one thing. Like, with a different card pool, this ability would suck, and with a different ability, this card pool would be worse. I think Bob is largely the same across the board because it all ties together so nicely. Monterey Jack's what you expect of an A-tier stat line. Total of 6 defensively, though I'll mention that 5 foot tends to be very useful, especially with access to green cards, and 4 in book proactively. His ability is very good. If you're able to reliably trigger it, which is not always the case, but often the case, then you're going to be generating a lot of extra draw or resources or both over the course of a game. But unfortunately, in my tier list, I barely got it in my B tier. This is an outlier. This is one of the most glaring differences on this entire video, I think. He is so much lower ranked than I have either his ability or his stat line. A lot of that is because the deck building for Monterey Jack is really janky. A lot of green cards want you to have more green cards as you upgrade, and a lot of yellow cards are really important level 0 yellow cards. So being locked into green 0 with only 5 level 0 Seeker cards is very awkward in a lot of ways. I really think it's just the card pool for me. Just the deck building awkwardness of transitioning from a one-head rogue to a one-head Seeker does not feel good for me at all, no matter how I try to build him. And I've tried to build him a lot of ways. I've just never been remotely happy with it. That said, I think Monterey Jack's a very good character. The characters I have in B tier are all quite good. They're not like the low end of good to the high end of good. They're all quite good. The low end of good is people that I have at the top of my C tier. I think Monterey Jack's a really strong character, but his janky deck building just really does not let him get any higher in my tier list and live up to what his ability is promising. Lastly, we have Gloria Goldberg, our only novella-only character at the moment. Her stat line's really well optimized. She's a 5-head mystic. That's all you need to know. Her ability is insane, the best ability in the game, the reason I knew I had to make an S+ tier. Because it's just a one-stop shot to tell the Mythos deck no. If Gloria's in your game and the Mythos deck is hurting you, something has gone wrong. And of course, tier list ranking with a really well optimized stat line, an actually good card pool, and on top of that, the best ability in the game, of course she makes it to S tier. I can say that she's elevated by her ability, and that's true, but everything else about her is already great. Mystic card pool with Seeker Slash is very good. We talked about that with Luke. Her stat line is a 5-head mystic. That's fantastic. Even with a different ability, she might have made it to S tier. But with this ability, obviously she makes it to S tier. It's hard to argue with that. So lastly, briefly ignore the terrible formatting on this table. I've been taking down notes about what made each character what they were. A lot of characters were about the same across the board. With this bunch of characters, everything was about the same. Whether it's because they all coincidentally lined up at the same part, or because they all were working together to result in the final power level, these characters don't have a specific thing that led to me thinking they ranked where they did. Now moving into the other sections, these are what caused characters to deviate and what I was trying to learn about. There are two really interesting things here that are sort of intuitively true, but I hadn't really put into words before I made this chart. There are no characters that I thought were elevated by their stat line. Certainly there are characters with good stat lines, and their stat lines are part of why they're better than other comparable characters. But the characters with bad stat lines might be held down by them. There was no character where I was like, oh yeah, this guy's an S tier character because of the stat line. It was a bunch of other things contributing to that. There's no such thing as a character that is put onto the tier list in their final position because their stat line is pushing them up. It might help them, but it's never the reason they rank where they do. Conversely, there's also no such thing as a character held down by their ability. There are a couple of characters with weak abilities, but by coincidence, those characters tend to either have something else that's even worse, or the entire character is weak and nothing changes about them. There's no character where I'm like, oh, they'd be higher on the tier list if they had an ability that did something. There's never a character where it stands out that their ability is somehow making them worse, with the possible exception of Lola if you don't view her as a gimmick character like I do. Which leads us with these 5 categories. Characters elevated by their ability or their card pool, and then much more diversely, characters held down by stat line, card pool, or other things. Other things is really interesting to me because there are 2 characters, coincidentally both Guardians, that were held down by things that weren't really a part of card pool, ability, or stat line. Roland is held down by his frailty. Roland has this brutally low 5-head soak for horror, and then a weakness that can give him mental traumas. And even though Guardians are well equipped to deal with that, that's still a little bit too much for him to really rank as highly as he otherwise would. Nacho, however, is held down by being an over-specialized fighter. There's only so many people on a map to kill. The fact that Nacho can kill every person on the map and then 4 more dudes is cool and all, but there are a lot of other fighters that can kill every person on the map and then another guy, which is already more than they needed. Nacho being, legitimately the single best boss killer in the game doesn't matter, because almost all the other fighters are still killing the boss. And the fact that he specialized so hard in this is just gross overkill, and it means he's not living up to how good his stat line and his ability could have been. Held down by Statline is exactly the characters that you might expect to see. Skids, Ginny Barnes, Joe Diamond, and Sister Mary. Skids and Ginny Barnes both just have miserable stat lines with 3s in their only proactive stats. Joe's 2s defensively are a miserable problem that really does not do him any favors. And Sister Mary, again, doesn't even have a 4 proactively. These character stat lines are very real, meaningful problems for them. Joe is weak because of his frailty, but his frailty can easily be blamed on his stat line, whereas with Roland it's actually a combination of his soak spread and his signature weakness. So there are a couple of characters where their stat line is easily the thing holding them down, but there aren't that many. It's interesting to me that stat lines are only ever going to contribute to your final ranking in a meaningful way if they're terrible. On the characters held down by card pool, we're mostly seeing characters that have either mono card pools or card pools that are damn near mono card pools. Winifred is mono green, Akachi is almost mono purple, so is Marie, Finn is almost mono green, and Rita is almost mono red. With Winifred, the main reason she's held down by her card pool isn't that mono green is bad. I'd argue it is the worst mono color to be, but the reason she's held down by her card pool is because the really good things about green cards tend to be the super broken combinations of assets they can set up. And Winifred's got to be a low asset deck to fuel her ability. And the skills in green, there are a lot of them, they trigger her ability very reliably, and they're very universally usable. All of that's good, but they aren't deduction, they aren't vicious blow. They're not generating value just by being a skill. The main value you're getting is going to be much more difficult to quantify things, and usually when you do try to put a number to them, it's going to be a lower number than get to more clues. So the thing with Winifred is that her card pool isn't giving her meaningful skills. It's just giving her a lot of usable skills, and that the assets that she wants directly conflicts with the way she has to build her high skill deck. With Akachi, she's just mono purple, and she's not as good as Jacqueline as far as mono purple abilities go, and Jim might be close to mono purple, but 5 splash is a lot of work. Mono purple in Akachi is a meaningful problem. She does have some really good cards with Hallowed Mirror and Occult Lexicon, provided I'm not losing my mind, and she really does have those cards. But she's still just not got anything going for her from her card pool. There's nothing there that's really elevating her. So as a consequence, she's just a 5-head Mystic with more Mystic juice. And that's good and all, but it's not great. It's not anywhere near breaking into my A tier. Or at least I hope that's the case, but all of the low-ranked Mystics might just be moving up approximately half a tier, because being a low-ranked Mystic is better than I'm giving it credit for. Marie's in a similar boat. She's got 5 splash, but her card pool is very awkward. The builds I've seen people talk about in the comments, I've had a hard time envisioning exactly how they're built, and I haven't felt great about them. And I really feel like capitalizing on her ability with the current Doom cards in the pool is just kind of difficult and janky and not as good as it could be. I feel like giving Finn 0 to 3 green, 0 to 5 illicit was a bad joke. That'd be like giving a Seeker 0 to 3 Seeker, 0 to 5 Insights. Like, how many level 4 or higher Insight cards even exist that aren't Seeker cards to begin with? The answer might actually be 0. But that's how it feels with Finn, too. Like, aside from the green guns, what even does Finn get? His card pool just does no favors to him. And he sort of needed a little bit of favors from his card pool. Generally speaking, if your card pool just shits the bed and gives you nothing, it's going to be a problem, and that's what happens with Finn. And with Rita, God, if she were a green character, she'd be so much better. That is not a statement I make frequently, but Rita really desperately wants more cards that use her foot or a different stat line. You can argue that she should have been up here with these guys. Whichever way you put her, though, her card pool and her stat line do not line up as well as they need to create a good character, and it really holds her down. There's actually a pretty diverse list of reasons why characters can be weak. In terms of characters that were elevated by their ability, I'm surprised at how few there were. Most of the characters with decidedly strong abilities, even characters like Gloria or Rex, had a lot of other really strong things, and it didn't feel like their ability was elevating them. I could easily add Gloria Rex to this, and it wouldn't be wrong. But when you look at Ashcan or Bob, like, everything that's good about them is their ability. That's the reason that they're remotely good, is their abilities are elevating them. With Gloria and Rex, if you strip out their ability and gave them something else, they'd still be very good characters. Dunwich Splash with Seeker in a good stat line is great. Seeker Splash with a 5-head Mystic is great. That's not as true with these other characters. Gloria and Rex have a lot going for them outside of their abilities, even though their abilities are some of the best ones in the game. There are very few characters that had powerful abilities that were a big part of where they ranked, and the rest of the character didn't live up to it. And likewise, there aren't that many characters where I look at them, and I think, oh man, they were really elevated by their card pool. Speaking of, I've clearly put Monterey in the wrong group. Monterey's card pool is the reason that he's not doing well. His level 0 deck doesn't feel right, neither does his level 20 deck. He never quite feels the way he should, because one-head Seekers really aren't a thing, and level 0 rogues don't have big money options, really. So he's basically just playing a Seeker that has to run You Handle This, and that feels real weird. Anyway, in the elevated by card pool group, we've got Agnes. 0-2 red is insane in a Mystic. It gives you more than this, but just Pete Sylvester level 2 and Test of Will is wild. Infinite Horror Soak, +1 head, second copy of Ward of Protection, sign me up. The card pool in Agnes is the best part of Agnes by a mile. Funnily enough, Min is also Red Splash, but I don't care about the Red Splash at all in Min. And Min, being a Seeker is what allows you to get her ability online. You have to find Analytical Mind, because that's the part of Min you actually care about, and Seeker Draw is what lets you do that. The cool stuff you get from Survivor isn't actually, super optimal to me. I don't feel like any of the scavenging shenanigans make it into, the best Min deck I can make. I feel like what makes Min strong is her ability, but to get that ability out and usable is so reliant on her Seeker card pool. With Leo Anderson, who for some reason got to have his last name, unlike everyone else, except for Nacho, because Nacho is basically that in my mind, it's just one word. But with Leo Anderson, he's elevated by his card pool very explicitly. He capitalizes on Cyclopean Hammer with green extra actions, he capitalizes on Hallowed Mirror to heal his team with green extra actions. He's just really inherently strong because of his green splash. It does so much work for him. For Preston, however strong Preston is, it's always going to be because of his card pool. It's just how well can the card pool capitalize on family inheritance? And the answer, now that Edge of the Earth is out, is pretty damn well. Preston has enough ways to function as a big money deck, or as a Dark Horse deck before he transitions to big money, that he's just really, really strong at this point. I'm not sure why I had Lily listed under Elevated by Card Pool. She should really be down here with Held Down by Other for Scenario 1 variants. And a big point of making this video was to learn more about the characters and try to better understand what makes them strong. And one thing, I think what I learned the most, is that maybe Arkham Horror is just a really well-designed game. As you can see, there are 50 investigators. I didn't do parallels for this. I don't feel like I had a good grasp on the parallel characters. But there are 50 actual investigators. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 19. We have 19 characters where they didn't feel like they were roughly the same power level, no matter how I analyze them. The fact that literally 3/5 of the characters in this game feel like they have very similar power levels no matter what lens I look at them through is probably a really good mark of good game design. It's definitely interesting to realize that stat lines being good is way less important than stat lines being bad. Stat lines being bad can kill a character, but stat lines being good is always just icing on the cake. And it's also interesting to realize that abilities never really hurt anyone. There are a couple of characters where they're meaningfully elevated by their ability, and there are a lot of characters where a big part of their strength is their ability, but there are no characters where they are literally being held down by their ability. You can argue Lola, but I've already talked about gimmick characters and how I view built-in limitations with that. Something interesting is that amongst the characters I view as being weak because of their card pool, I've got 3 of the people who were showing up in my heavily conflicted B tier. 4, actually. There's Finn as well. And I think this might be a learning thing for me, where I'm these characters feel janky, but that doesn't mean they're bad. Janky doesn't equal bad, it just means it feels unpleasant. It might not be working the way I want, it might feel like all the joints are filled with sand, but at the end of the day, if it crushes the game, it crushes the game, no matter how awkward it felt to build the deck. I feel like there's definitely more interesting things to say about this experiment, but none of them come to mind right now. I've been talking about this for literally 2 hours. Hopefully the video comes out to be a lot shorter than that. So I'm going to rest my brain on this. I might make a follow-up video to this at some point that's like 10 to 20 minutes long at most. And if I do, it'll probably just be like responding to or restating comments in this video. So you tell me what you think in the comments. What insightful things can be gleaned from this that I missed, or what things do you think I was just wrong about that could have been understood through different ways? For now, though, I'm done. My brain, I feel fine, but the fact that I can't think, and it's been 2 hours, implies I'm not. I'm pretty sure I'm fried, so I'm going to call it for recording of the day. I've been Rather Coherent. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.